Wow, attendees are joining in like anything. This is the fastest we've seen this number grow. Wow. Hi, everybody. A
Hello,
very good
everyone.
evening. A very good evening to all of you. We're just waiting for more of you to join in. A lot of enthusiasm here. We received a great number of registrations, and I understand your enthusiasm. It's completely legit. We have legends amongst us today, and we couldn't have been more grateful for them giving us their precious time to have this really important conversation. And we are very thankful to you also that you decided to participate in this. You decided to come and learn more about it and discuss what should have been discussed before as well. So, just a very warm welcome. If there is anything that you would like to talk about, introduce yourself or say, or chit chat, you can use the chat box right in front of you. When you choose the option that says all panelists and attendees, then you will be able to share whatever you're saying with other attendees as well. If you choose just all panelists, then only the panelists will be able to see. And after, if there are any specific questions that you need them to be addressed, then please put them in the Q&A box. We'll take the relevant questions from you towards the end of today's webinar. I'll just quickly type in the chat box. So thank you so much, everybody. The times are extremely tough, and we understand that everybody is collectively going through a lot of things, but you have gathered here today with us, and Senior Advocate Yug Chaudhary and Senior Advocate Mihir Desai, sir, have graced us with their presence. Thank you so much for that, sir. I would just like to hand over the mic to Sonali for a bit to give you a brief introduction of why we decided to have this conversation today. Sonali Chugh is the editor of Academic. She's done her master's in law, politics, and society from Ambedkar University, and she is the one person who actually made all of this happen as well. So, Sonali, over to you.
Thank you for coming, everyone. When writing about court and confinement in captive imagination, Varavara Rao, who's also one of the accused in the Bhima Koregaon case, wrote a poem on under trials who look towards or look forward to the court hearing and the process that follows. Please bear with me as I do a very bad job at reciting the poem. Open those dockets and you will see our faces in those papers. You fold us lengthwise and like nail bags sealed. Addressed and tossed aside, you scribble adjournments on your backs and cast us aside. Between adjournments, arguments, and counter arguments, men's head roll and their hearts are frozen between penalty and goal in the court halls of justice. This poem reminds us of Father San Swami hearing I witnessed his plea, and in the sense I didn't witness it, but I saw the thread where he spoke about his body shutting down on him with each passing day. He spoke about the medicines and other supplies which were inadequate and too little for his severe condition. Despite him pleading for medical bail, the court could not hear him, neither did the law. Before we start and introducing the two most senior advocates here, I would like to give you some context. A number of subsequent arrests happened after the violence broke out in Bhima Koregaon between Dalits and Marathas. This happened on January 1, 2018. The first round of arrests happened in June 8, 2018, when a bunch of professors, authors, and lawyers, and to name few, Shoma Sen, Sudhir Dhavule, and Surendra Gatling and Rona Wilson were arrested. And the second round of arrests happened in August, where Sudha Bhardwaj was also arrested. This was August 2018, followed by and there Gautam Lakha was also arrested in the first day. These their houses were also raided, and then in April 2020, Anand Teltumde and Gautam Navlakha surrendered themselves, followed by the rest of the Kabir Kala Manch artists, theatre artists, as well as members, who were also part in organizing the Elgar Parishad, which was blamed in the police FIR, the Pune police FIR in the first place. The arrest followed by Hani Babu's arrest in July, I think, and then Father Stan Swami's arrest in October.
Now that you know a little bit about, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Now that we have a little bit of context of the case that we are going to discuss, among other things, representing some of the accused persons in this case are our esteemed guests this evening. We say that law is a noble profession, and lawyers actually have the ability to serve their society in the most honest, in the most caring of manners. And we have these two gentlemen with us who are extremely knowledgeable, accomplished. They have devoted their lives to save other lives, and they have been successful, and they keep trying, and they are here with us today. I will never be able to tell you all of their accomplishments, and whatever words I use to introduce you to them will never be enough. And I'm sure that all of you that are here today, you must know of them already, and today we're going to talk to them. I'll just give you a brief introduction, something that would help you communicate with them. But this is not all, this is not enough. Senior advocate Mihir Desai is a human rights activist and lawyer. He's practicing as a senior counsel both in the Bombay High Court and the Honorable Supreme Court. He's also the National Vice President of the People's Union for Civil Liberties. Senior Advocate Desai is the co-founder of Indian People's Tribunal and Human Rights Law Network. Additionally, he was involved in the Olga Tellis, Zakia Jafri, Khwaya Yunus, and the Sohrabuddin case. Senior Advocate Yug Mohit Chaudhary is a youth scholar and an ace human rights lawyer, practicing at the Bombay High Court and the Honorable Supreme Court. He has spearheaded the movement for the abolition of the death penalty in India. He has taught at Delhi's St. Stephen College and has done his doctorate in English from Oxford. Apart from the Bhima Koregaon case, he was involved in the Mahendranath Das case. He also represented Surinder Kohli and argued against his hanging in the Nithari serial killing case. We decided to make best use of the platform that we have, and Sonali made this happen when we arranged this session to address the Bhima Koregaon case and the processes of hearings, pleas, and orders in the light of the draconian laws such as UAPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. And today we are hoping to discuss the legalities of it with the two of most esteemed senior advocates who are also involved with the proceedings. Thank you so much, sir, for being here with us today, for your precious time, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I'll start with the first question, which is just giving me context. The Bhima Koregaon case is very complex, and all accused have struggled with the trial as well as getting a bail. So, as we know that for arrest under acts like Unlawful Prevention Activities Act, Anantil Tumbe said that the process is a punishment. So could you just share the several processes that have been there vis-a-vis after the arrest, vis-a-vis the cases which you were involved in more than anything?
Yug, you want to start?
Mihir, you go ahead, please.
Okay. Remember one thing, that the case started with a first information report which was lodged at Pune on 8th of January 2018. The background to this was that there was a meeting called Elgar Parishad on 31st of December 2017 at Pune. And this meeting, every year there is a place called Bhima Koregaon where a large number of Dalits visit that place, because in order to commemorate a war which took place, a battle rather, not a war, but a battle which took place in 1818, where Dalits on part of the British and against the Peshwai, and they treat it as the victory of Dalits, and they come every year to that place. Elgar Parishad was organized. The main organizers were the retired Supreme Court Judge Justice Sawant, and a retired High Court Judge, Justice Kolche Patil, and various about 250 Dalit groups from across Maharashtra, basically commemorating what is happening and talking about what is happening, the situation in India today, etc., etc. On the next day was the Bhima Koregaon, commemoration, which happens, which is not in Pune, which is a little away from Pune. And there was some violence. There were some attacks on Dalits, and FIRs came to be lodged. Now, the initial FIR said that there were certain right-wing Hindu groups which were involved in attacking the Dalits. Okay. Subsequently, there was an FIR filed saying that the speeches given at the Bhima Koregaon, at the Elgar Parishad on 31st December led to this violence. Okay. And that FIR was not did not have incorporate any sections of UAPA, etc., etc. It was a simple hate speech kind of a FIR. Okay, normal Indian Penal Code provisions, and about 7 or 8 people were named in that. That these are the people who gave speeches, and that this was that. Now, after about 2-3 months, the scope of the FIR was expanded by including not only conspiracy, okay, but also the UAPA sections. Okay, and saying that this was not just speeches given at Elgar Parishad, but also there was a conspiracy by the Naxals to infiltrate the Elgar Parishad and to create violence. Okay. This is how they expanded. After that, houses were raided of Surendra Gadling, who is an advocate. It's important to understand who the people are. Okay. Surendra Gadling is an advocate who has been practicing in Nagpur High Court since last more than 25-30 years. You had other people, Rona Wilson, whose house was raided, who is in Delhi, who is an academician in Delhi. You had other people, a professor in Nagpur University who was raided. So certain an activist, a Dalit activist, was raided in Bombay. So these are the people whose houses were raided, and after a few months, after 2 months, the raids happened in April, and after 2 months, they were arrested in June. So, but the initial arrests were, I think, about 5 or 6 people were arrested initially. After 2 months, in August, they expanded the scope of this whole thing, and then they arrested certain other people, in which are, as you mentioned, Sudha Bharadwaj and various other people who were Varavara Rao and various other people were included in that group, and they were sought to be arrested. Now that matter had gone to Supreme Court. People might have heard in the famous case of Romila Thapar and others versus the state of Maharashtra. And at that time, what happened was that, of course, they were initially given house arrest, and after the house arrest, they were later on the court said, no, the house arrest will continue for some time, but you will have to be, incarcerated. You apply for your bail. You are free to apply for bail, etc., etc. So that is what happened. So those people are in jail. After about a year, after about 6 months, after about a year, the NIA, that is the National Investigation Agency, took over the investigation from the Pune police. This happened when the government changed. Earlier, the government, as you know, was the BJP Shiv Sena alliance. When the government changed to Shiv Sena NCP Congress alliance, then the central government stepped in and got the NIA to take in the investigation. This is what happened. At that point of time, about another 3 or 4 people were immediately arrested. They belong to the Kabir Kala Manch, okay, which is a group which is basically a cultural group of Dalits who sing and say shairi and all that kind of thing. They were arrested. In the meanwhile, what had happened was that in respect of both Gautam Navlakha and Anand Teltumde, okay, they were out on anticipatory. Some kind of a protection from the court, they were out. Okay? But finally, that protection ended in in March 2021, when the Supreme Court did not chose not to protect them any further, and then they were there. I mean, surrendered in the sense it was not that they were underground. They were, but the court said that now that we are ending the protection, you go to the police station and surrender yourself. So it was that kind of a surrender. So that's when both of them surrendered. And after that, there were two more arrests. One was of Heni Babu, and the other arrest was of Father Stan Swami. I must mention just now, since I'm talking about it, that Father Stan Swami is in hospital right now. And today morning, he has been detected with COVID, and he's on oxygen. And it's a complete criminal negligence on part of the jail authorities, which has led to this. I'll just stop here and let you continue with this, and then this aspect.
Here does Holy Family have a COVID ward?
Yes, it has.
Will they need to treat him simultaneously for his other problems and COVID?
Yes. They have. So they will be able to treat them. But in fact, as soon as he was taken to the hospital, he was taken to the Holy Family Hospital day before yesterday night. His oxygen level was already down. He was already on fever. I don't know why the jail authorities, who took him for 3 times to JJ Hospital in 10 days, did not do an RT-PCR test. Okay, which is itself scandalizing, that for 3 times you take him to JJ Hospital in 10 days and you don't do an RT-PCR test. And now this is a situation. We don't know what will happen. Hopefully,
what are his oxygen levels mean?
With 8 liters of oxygen, 8 liters of oxygen, it is about 85%. Yeah, so that's the thing. Anyway, now you can.
See, I'll tell you how I see this case. So Mihir has given you the facts as they are on paper. And that's how just the bare chronology. Now let's look behind what is happening. According to me, it's not, I think this is a large scale and well thought out, and I would use the word advisedly, conspiracy to arrest, to use this case as an excuse to launch a witch hunt and a fishing expedition against some of the most senior, respected and inspirational figures in Indian civil society. I see this case as a pretext by the government to silence these people and put them away for such a long period of time that not only will their voices be silenced and their backs be broken, but it will serve as a warning to others about what fate awaits them should they dare speak against this government. I see this case as a political witch hunt with just a fig leaf of decency and legality to cover it.
As you said about that, I would like to, we had another question scheduled for you, but before we move on, I think it's better that I ask you about the same. Since you say that it is a witch hunt, and so this is a draconian law like the NSA, etc. And there was the decongestion of jails, which happened last year. And the court ordered for high power committees to monitor the release of prisoners on bail or parole. And again, this year, the court ordered for the same, that people who were released last year should be released again. But in 2020, amidst the pandemic, Heni Babu and Father Stan Swami were also arrested. Do you think that this presents a dichotomy in the way the court interprets the rights of prisoners and also like under trials? And how exceptional is UAP, NSA, etc. in that case, when they work despite of and because of the health emergency that was there?
Here you go first.
You go. You spoke very little.
No, I don't want to speak more, Mihir.
Okay, fine. Anyway.
All right, I take this first. See, the way the courts, there is a big difference in the manner in which the courts approach an IPC case, a regular murder, robbery, rape, cheating, forgery, and the way they approach a case under UAPA, which is a political case. And this is not just a standard political case, it's a case in which the government has a very strong vested interest. Now, in a normal UAPA case, the courts are extremely deferential to the government and the prosecution. In a case such as this, which has such clear political leanings and overtones, and in fact is very evidently a witch hunt, the courts have been overly compliant and subservient to the government. It is shocking. It is a scandal. It is a disgrace. The court should have shown a bit of spine. They should have shown some independence. They should have scrutinized the material that was presented to them by the prosecuting agency as a justification for arresting and keeping these people in custody. Because there is just no material worth the name to justify these people being arrested and kept in custody. But till date, 2 years have passed and not a single court has scrutinized the material. Now, you would never find this in an IPC case. You would never find this in a non-political case. It's shocking. How many times have we been to court? And still the court has not even examined the material. Something as basic as this evidence, they have filed so many charge sheets against these prisoners. The question we are asking again and again, is all this material, let us believe it to be true. Is it admissible in a court of law under the Indian Evidence Act? Not a single one of these documents that they claim that was seized from the computers of these activists, not a single one of them is admissible under law. And yet, on the basis of these fraudulent documents, these people have been kept in jail for 3 years. The NIA won't come forward and defend these the legal admissibility of these documents. The court won't ask them. And we have been crying in the wilderness again and again, and we have not been getting any answers.
Can I just...
Before I ask you, yes, sir.
No, I was just, first of all, I just wanted to say that I completely agree with the political and legal analysis which Yug presented. I'm both in terms of the, see, look at the kind of people who have been arrested, okay? They are lawyers, social activists, trade unionists, academicians, cultural activists, okay, activists who work with tribals. It's like a whole range of people from different segments of society, okay, who are in a sense anti-establishment, yes, okay, because they question the establishment's various policies, not because they are violent, but because they question the establishment's various policies, okay. So the whole, all constituencies have been arrested, trying to send in a message that if you speak against us, this is what is going to happen to you. And the second thing which I just wanted to say before handing it back to you is that as far as this, the nature of evidence which you also mentioned about, I mean, look at it. Now, except for one person, okay, out of the 16 who are arrested, who was present at the Elgar Parishad, it is not even the prosecution's case that the balance 15 were present at the place where these speeches were made. It is not even their case that these people were involved in organizing. There is no specific offense with which they are charged. See, this is also the problem with UAPA. There is no specific offense with which they are charged. It's not that they went and killed somebody. It's not that they bombed somewhere. It's not that they, it's not that a particular person on a particular date supplied arms to somebody. This is not the case. Okay. So under UAPA, this is what happens, that without having a concrete offense, you can put people behind bars for years together. So that's it.
Ali?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, we had this question also, which you have partly already answered, that in light of the raids that have been conducted before the arrests of Hani Babu and or Gautam Navlakha, where NIA confiscated laptops, etc., is electronic evidence becoming a norm, and is it hard to argue the case because of the same, uh, especially within the context of UAPA?
Yug, you want to go ahead?
Electronic evidence has been part of the landscape, at least in Indian criminal trials, now for quite some time. There's no problem with electronic evidence. It must pass muster. It must pass the Evidence Act, the tests of the Evidence Act. Now, electronic evidence is a document under law, just like any other document. A film is a document, a photograph is a document, a letter is a document. A document can be admissible in a court during a trial only if two conditions minimally are satisfied. First, you must have somebody who is the author of the document. The authorship of the document must be proved. It must be shown who made this document. And the second, the truth of the contents of the document must be proven. Let me explain this to you. So you have a letter which says that A killed B. Now, who wrote this letter? Why is that important? It's important is because we have to judge the truth of the letter. We have to judge the authenticity of the letter. And the character of the writer, whether he's a forger, whether he's a thief, whether he's an honest person, whether he's a known dishonest person, whether he's a liar, is a very important ingredient in judging the authenticity of the letter. Therefore, the authorship of the letter is a very primary ingredient to be proved before the letter can be admitted into evidence. Secondly, the contents of the letter have to be shown to be proved, to be true. It has to be shown that A did kill B. The truth of the contents, the letter is saying A killed B. Somebody has to be examined to prove that A killed B. Otherwise, that letter cannot be called evidence. Now, in this case, 95%, almost 95% of the entire evidence in this case against all the prisoners consists of the following. A letter written by A to B saying that C committed an offense, and the letter is found in the possession of D. Now, can you imagine? And they do not know who A is, who wrote the letter. They cannot prove who B is, and they cannot even prove that an offense has been committed apart and independent of the contents of the letter. Just imagine this situation. A letter which says that A killed B. They're not even asked to prove that B was dead. They're just relying on this letter to say that A killed B without even proving that B is dead, let alone that B is murdered. Further, if it's a letter written from A to B saying that C was killed, at least prove that A exists. They don't even know whether A exists. They do not even know who A is. Just some random letter found in some other person's computer, allegedly found. And remember, these are not even hard copies of letters. These are images of letters. These are typed, unsigned, undated images of letters. They do not even constitute secondary evidence under law. This is how fictitious and shallow this entire case is. It's only made up of shadows. There's nothing in this case. It will not stand 5 minutes of honest legal scrutiny.
Thank you.
And just to add to what you said, just to clarify it a little further, that these are not even emails. Okay, I can understand if it's an email written by A to B. Okay, these are not even found in emails. These are just typed copies supposedly found in somebody's computer. Okay,
they're just images. They're just images. That's all.
Absolutely. So how do you? But on placing reliance on this, people have been denied bail for 2.5 years. Okay. Placing reliance on these this is the sum total of the evidence on which they are placing reliance. Okay. And that's the whole problem. Of course, you will prove that these letters are completely bogus and can't be used at the time when the trial starts. When will the trial starts? We don't even know. Okay, so that's the situation. That ultimately you may rely on what you want, but you can't keep. And remember, there is a presumption of innocence in our country. You can't. All these people are under trials.
So,
One thing-
ironically, just one
Yeah,
thing,
go
sir.
ahead.
US-based digital consultant Arsenal Consulting's report said that the electronic devices of both Rona Wilson and Anand Teltumde were planted. However, the NIA ironically called the digital consultant's report unreliable, even though the Arsenal report was verified by different other sources. And here they are relying, just like you relayed, relying on pictures of some letters and keeping them behind bars.
If this was reversed, if let's say that NIA was presenting the report and it said that this is what the activists have done, and this was some outsourced report, which NIA said that you cannot bring in this evidence at this moment. But if it was the prosecution story that this has been done by these people and a certain agency show this, that would have been okay and acceptable by the court.
Well, look at it this way. Let me just talk a little bit about this Arsenal report. Basically, what the Arsenal report seems to say is that the documents which are found on Arsenal has only examined Rona Wilson's computer as yet. Okay, and what they say, and a number of these documents by which, say, Anand Teltumde is being prosecuted, is on the basis of something found on Rona Wilson's computer, written by somebody else to supposedly to Anand Teltumde, not found from Anand Teltumde, not found from that other person, as Yug was saying, but found on Rona Wilson's computer an image. Okay, this is the basis on which they've gone. Now, what Arsenal says is that they've conducted a study, and they found on the basis of a study that these documents were actually planted on the computer of Rona Wilson by an outside agency. They were planted there. They do not originate from his computer. They are not typed on his computer. They are never opened on his computer. Okay, so this is what the Arsenal report says, and some of us are trying to use this report in court. Okay. To disprove what the NIA say. That's the basic thing. So a study was commissioned, and they've done a study, and by an internationally reputed organization, and this is what they have found on the basis of the clone copy supplied to us by the prosecution. You
know? I would like to also ask, since you're talking about evidence and you're talking about bail also, Section 43D5 is one of the many reasons that UAPA is considered draconian. And but there was a setback in the Zahoor Vatali judgment, which made inadmissibility of prosecution documents irrelevant when deciding bail cases. But then some hope came from, I don't know if it did, but it came from K. Najib judgment, as it was said, that which disassociated itself from the Vatali judgment. But it said that now that we're deciding is the granting bail on accounts of violation of Part 3 of the fundamental rights of the Constitution. So could you just explain what 43D5 is and what is your opinion on the same? And both Vatali judgment and K. Najib judgment, did they have any impact on Bhima Koregaon, or has it made arguing difficult or easy?
Yug.
Yeah, sure. Vatali's judgment says, you see, let me first tell you what 43D5 says. 43D5 says that unlike normal criminal jurisprudence, unlike 437 and 439 CRPC, which is the power of a court to grant bail, 43D5 will govern the criteria for bail in all UAPA cases. So the first thing is that regular bail jurisprudence will not apply. Second, 43D5 further says that a court will only grant bail if, on perusal of the police papers, it reaches the conclusion that there are strong grounds to believe that the accused are guilty, prima facie guilty. Now, this is what 43D5 says. Our court, our Supreme Court, in Vatali's case, went many steps further. 43D5 is an obnoxious provision. But in Vatali's case, the Supreme Court went many steps further and said, instead of reading it down, they, I think, read it up and said that questions of admissibility, authenticity, genuineness, reliability cannot be gone into at all during a bail hearing. During a bail hearing under UAPA, it will have to be presumed that the prosecution case is true, that the witnesses are honest, that the claims are genuine, and that the documents are admissible and good. Now, this all will have to be taken as being true and presumed to be good. True. It is only after presuming all this do you then look into the question, is there evidence which would suggest that the accused are prima facie guilty? And only on the basis of the prosecution documents, which you cannot question. So if, for example, the prosecution has relied on a document which is, let us say, a confession by an accused to a police officer whilst in custody, which is squarely hit by section 25 and 26 of the Evidence Act and is inadmissible in law, even in a UAPA NIA trial. Suppose the only evidence adduced by the prosecution is such a document, and you apply for bail saying there is no evidence against me which is admissible in a court of law, the court will tell you that on the basis of Vatali's judgment, we cannot decide whether or not, we cannot even look into whether or not this document is admissible. We have to presume it is admissible. And therefore, on the basis of this document, which shows that you have committed an offense, we are going to have to deny you bail. It doesn't matter if after 5 years of remaining in jail, you are immediately acquitted the moment the trial begins, because the only evidence against you is an inadmissible document. It doesn't matter. You will still stay in jail, because the process is the punishment in these cases. Remember this, in all political trials, normal IPC trials have been reduced, shortened. The period of under trial incarceration has drastically been reduced. But in political trials, the period of under trial incarceration is what they are trying to use to break you. Ultimately, you will be acquitted. You will find at some stage, either at the primary stage or at the appellate stage, you will find a judge who has the guts to stand up and say, look, there is no evidence. Maybe initially not, but subsequently you will. Our system does have that. But you will be broken in the process. You will stay in jail for that entire process of time. Second thing to remember is this: the rate of acquittals and convictions in political cases. The third thing to remember is, where are these political cases taking place? Just look back at TADA. What was your rate of conviction in TADA? 2%. 2 out of every 100 cases resulted in conviction. The other 98 were acquitted. Further, where were the maximum TADA cases instituted? Was it in Kashmir, which had terrorist problems? No. Was it in Punjab, which had terrorist problems? No. In Gujarat in the 1980s, the maximum number of TADA cases in 1980s, 1990s. So where is the law being properly used, or is it being misused? Or is it being used to target the minorities, which is what TADA was used for, which is why it had to be abolished, why it was repealed. So you please keep all these things in mind when you understand and approach a political case such as the present Elgar Parishad case.
You want to speak about Najib's case?
Najib. Now, yes, thanks Mihir for reminding me. See now, so Vatali's case is a major problem for bail. Now, it is thought that Najib's case offers some respite, and maybe it does, but it doesn't really do very much, I think. It perhaps, if a judge wants to help you, it will allow him to help you, let us say it like that, but only if certain very stringent conditions are met. What Najib does is it reiterates the position that has always been there in Indian law, that the statutory power of bail doesn't exhaust the power of a constitutional court to grant bail. So the power under 43D5 does not exhaust a constitutional court's power to grant bail. A Constitutional Court retains power under 226 in the defense of Article 21 to grant bail. So, for example, medical bail. Now, 43D5 doesn't speak of medical bail, medical reasons as being a ground for bail. It only says you can grant bail if you have reason to believe that the accused are innocent. It doesn't say you can grant bail if the accused is dying or doesn't needs medical treatment. So, where does the power to grant bail come from in such cases? It comes from the Constitution, Article 21, and you approach the courts under 226, and they grant you medical bail. Similarly, for example, the court says if the trial hasn't begun for a very long period of time, your rights under Article 21 are violated. Therefore, under 226, you can approach a court and ask for bail. So, these are very narrow circumstances under which you can approach a court. You will have to wait for many years to pass, or you will have to wait before you are sick and dying. And then you can get the benefit of Najib's case. It offers a little respite, not too much, but very little. And that will be much too late, I think.
Just to on a slightly different point, you see, you must remember that both the two earlier laws, that is TADA and POTA, okay, which were in a sense the precursors to the UAPA 2008 amendments and all that, both of them had sunset clauses, which means what, that after 2 years or 3 years, they had to be placed again before the parliament if you wanted to continue them. Otherwise, they would lapse. The whole idea was that these are emergency situations for which we need emergency laws. And once that emergency situation comes to an end, once the laws will lapse. So every 2 years, for instance, TADA used to be placed before the parliament, okay, in order for ratifying. Okay. And finally, in 1995, there was a major opposition. Remember, at that time, the Human Rights Commission, the National Human Rights Commission, wrote a letter to every MP. Okay, the chairman of the National Human Rights Commission wrote a letter to every MP saying, do not allow this law to be continued. Okay, of course, today expecting the National Human Rights Commission to do that is just dreaming. But those were different times, Similar, also remember under POTA, for instance, not under TADA, but under POTA, as far as the bail conditions were stringent, but it was also provided that after 1 year of incarceration, you would be covered by the ordinary bail conditions. Okay? UAPA doesn't have anything of that kind. Okay, UAPA the same bail stringent conditions apply till the time you are in jail, trial ends, appeal goes, everything, till that time. The same stringent bail conditions apply. So that's also something which we need to be conscious of.
Something that I would like to follow it up with is, you mentioned NHRC, and according to the MHA statement in Lok Sabha, which referred to the NCRB data, there is a definite increase in the number of arrests made under UAPA per year. And UAPA, NSA, Gunda Act, sedition, all these work on vague terminologies. And the mention or definition of unlawful is very vague. Now the UP COCA is going to, I don't know when it will come, but it will come eventually. And UPSF, SSF. From being used against a terrorist as an exception to now constructing new categories of danger. And this I'm asking more so in the terms when at least we know activists who are arrested under UAPA right now in the Bhima Koregaon case. I'm talking about places like Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand, where the rate of arrest is probably more higher, and where the charge sheets are not filed, and where this is a norm. So do you think that the unlawful is made or constructed primarily in the police case report, that it does not exist in reality, but it is sort of constructed within the report? And how wide is the term association now? In respect, as in, I think even we can be arrested in association. So,
here you go ahead.
Okay. It is true that as it happens with many of the cases or many of the offenses, or historically, even if you see, it's when some prominent persons or some activists or some prominent politicians get arrested, the focus becomes a national focus. Okay, that happens with whether it is the Delhi riot cases, whether it's the Bhima Koregaon cases, or if it's something very very shocking like what happened with the toolkit case or something like that, then it gets problem. It's only when a rape happens in a Delhi bus that it gets the kind of prominence, okay, which rapes happening countrywide even today, okay, do not get that kind of prominence. So the fact of the matter is, yes, that there are certain kind of incidents, certain kind of offenses which do get prominence over others, but that doesn't mean that the others are not important. What you are saying is right, that in Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, etc., the use of this law is quite a lot. Not only the use of this law, but also the use of all these what we call the state of exception laws, like whether you call NSA or whether these special Makoka in Maharashtra and similar laws, Public Safety Act in Chhattisgarh, AFSPA in Kashmir and in Northeast. Okay, if you look at all, and sedition, or right now, if you see, sedition is being used in a very very widespread manner. So all these laws are a collective of laws which are used essentially to repress people, okay? Repress the democratic rights of people. Who are the people who are arrested? Okay, these are prominent persons, but even if you see Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, etc., who are the look at Father Sten, who was he working with? He was working with people, tribals, okay? 3,000 tribals are in jail, okay, in Jharkhand, and he filed a public interest litigation saying that these people are in jail on the ground that they are Naxalites. Okay, nothing more. They are tribals, poor tribals who are just trying to resist, who are trying to put up stones called Pathalgadi. There is a movement going on there, which is basically put up stones. On stones, you write the constitutional provisions that I have a right to equality. For that, they are being arrested, put behind bars under UAPA. And Father Sten had filed a petition opposing that. And then so he gets arrested. You see, so yes, all these kind of NSA is being used very. Look at the doctor who was arrested in UP for exposing a scam, or you have people being arrested in Northeast under sedition. You have people being arrested in UP. I mean, it's just the kind of terrorism, state terrorism, as one would call it, okay, is so widespread. And they used. There were times when they were going beyond the law, but now what they are doing is they have acquired the art of using the law against people, okay, using repressive laws against people, and that is something which is happening in a very widespread manner, and something which we all must fight against, and we must as students or as lawyers, we must speak out against. It's very important.
Absolutely, sir. Sir, would you like to Yug sir, would you like to add to that?
Nikhil has said everything that needs to be said on an answer. It's a complete answer. Nothing further to add. Thank you.
Absolutely, sir. So there are newer forms of draconian that have started operating despite the presence of UAPA and NIA. For instance, UPCOCA, which mimics MACOCA at the state level, or the Gunda Act. So do you think that these laws that are localized, Makoka.
Yeah, Makoka.
Right. So do you think that these laws that are localized, and that is why they present a more dangerous situation? And do you think that the same is meant to target certain communities, which are meant to keep people in prisons for longer, just like it's happening in UAPA?
Yes, of course, you're right. So they are far more dangerous because their scope is they target a lot many more people. Now, if you look at the Chhattisgarh Public Safety Act, for example, it has provisions which are similar to UAPA, banning banning various things which should not ever be banned. And the local act, in its application, doesn't require sanctions. It doesn't require so many of the protections that are there in other central laws, and they are applied very rampantly across the state by the police. So these local acts, which mirror the larger central acts, are in a sense much more pernicious. Yes, you're right about that.
Please, sir, would you like to share your opinions as well?
No, I completely agree with what Yug is saying, and you are right that even if you see forget UAPA, even if you see the general population in prisons, okay, Like you have about 4,75,000 people in prisons across the country today, in today's time. Okay, and you have about 60% of those being either scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, or Muslims. So obviously it reflects a reality which is not reflected in the actual population of these people. So there are certain communities which are being which are easily, I mean, you still have, I mean, I know this even 5 years or even possibly today it exists. Like earlier you have this criminal tribes law, okay, where which has been repealed now, the Criminal Tribes Act. There used to be a Criminal Tribes Act where an offense happens in an area, you just arrest somebody from a particular tribe because it's supposed to be a criminal tribe. Now that has gone away from the this thing, letter of the law. But if you go to the police station, they still maintain diaries of these criminal tribes and who are the members of those tribes. Only because they belong to a particular tribal community, they are presumed to be guilty of offenses. That. So you have this happening across the country. Yeah.
Right, sir. So do you think that in matters of national... Yes, Sunil.
I was going to ask the same question. That do you think that in matters of national security or terrorism, the courts are sort of, they give up in terms of, I mean, they always favor the prosecution, and that is something that we have observed in previous judgments also. In Afzal, starting from Afzal Guru, if we were to look and read the judgment to now, do you think that this, again, the Batali judgment is also sort of indicative of the same thing? So could you just share your opinion on the same?
Here you go first. I have a lot to say.
So do I. I mean, let me start by saying I'm extremely disappointed with the judiciary in terms of its recent human rights record. Okay, whether it be criminal law or whether it be migrants walking on the street during a pandemic, or whether it's refusing to take up the CAA NRC cases, whether it's a refusal to take up 370A abrogation cases. You see, whether it is refusal to take up Rafale case. Okay, so I'm totally disappointed, extremely disappointed with the way the Supreme Court has been functioning in recent times. It's wonderful to make bombastic judgments on privacy and things like that, okay, which doesn't concretely help any person. When it comes to actually helping people, that's the test. You see, the test is there. That are you actually helping people? It's fine saying that privacy is a right, etc., etc. It makes it is noticed by international people and all that kind of thing. Yeah, wonderful. 377, good judgment, undoubtedly. But when it comes to the real hardcore human rights jurisprudence, I feel it is. I think the court has become extremely conservative. Okay, and this is true not just in respect of criminal matters, criminal law matters, but also in respect of the non-criminal law matters. This is what I feel, that there has been a conservative trend which is growing of recent. It also reflects a conservative trend in the society. Okay, and they are willing to. I guess I'll stop there. Let Yug also has to say something. Yeah, Yug.
I think this is not just a product of a conservative trend. I think that I would say we are becoming more authoritarian. As a country, we are willing to be governed by authoritarian figures. And in this mood, this preference for authoritarianism, I think the court has abandoned its protection of democracy. Let me give you examples. When was the last time such a thing happened? They say it's during the emergency. Now it was said at that time that the Congress party only asked the courts to bend, but they chose to crawl. They were not asked to do too much, just bend a little bit, but they got so scared. There was so much of self-censorship that they actually crawled before the government. Now this is what was said about the emergency. We are seeing something very similar in the courts today. They have become more government-minded than the government. Sometimes you might find more liberal statements coming from prosecutors than you will from the judges. It's reached that stage. They are far more anxious to protect the government than the government is sometimes anxious to protect itself. Now, and you speak specifically in the case of terrorism, just give me a few examples here and there. Take the Rajiv Gandhi assassination case. 26 people put up for trial. 26 people, all of them convicted. All of them sentenced to hang. This was a Tada case, so there was no appeal in the High Court. The first appeal and the only appeal lay in the Supreme Court. In that first appeal, 19 out of the 26 were acquitted. The court said it was an embarrassing lack of evidence. What was the judge doing when he held them to be guilty and he gave those 19 people the death sentence? And the Supreme Court says of the same 19, there was an embarrassing lack of evidence. What was the trial court judge doing? Do you say that it was a mistake, an error of judgment? Or do you say he was just pandering to political sensibilities and requirements over here? Look at the Indira Gandhi assassination case. The conviction by the Supreme Court of Kehar Singh was described by a jurist no less than Sirvai as it was based on evidence that he wouldn't condemn a dog on the basis of such evidence. In that same Supreme Court judgment, when they acquitted one of the three accused, I forget his name, his name escapes me. It was on they said that the Delhi High Court, committed an embarrassing mistake in admitting and believing some evidence. How do these embarrassing mistakes happen again and again and again in political cases? And these are not mistakes. Please let us be very clear. These are acts which are guided by political bias and a desire to serve their political masters. The judiciary, as I said earlier, has become far more government-minded than it ever was before. It's become sensitive to protect the government, overly anxious to protect the government. We have never seen so many pro-government judgments coming from the Supreme Court as we have in the last 3 years. And we have never seen so many cases failing against the government as we have in the last 3 years. People apply for bail and the judge, Supreme Court Chief Justice tells them you are safer inside. Why do you want to go out? Stay in jail. It's okay. Is this how a Chief Justice of India is meant to talk when government action is being challenged?
Possibly you have seen only the last 5 or 10 years. But we have also seen the times when things were much more rosier, much more better, and we are sure, and at least I am sure that things will change for the better. But things don't change for the better on their own. And I always have faith in humanity. That humanity ultimately, I mean, look at what happened in Germany. Look at what happened subsequent to that, etc. So you see, these are things which do happen. But humanity is always overcome them. Only thing is that you cannot overcome them by only thinking about them. You will have to act on that. Okay, so if you are lawyers, then I would urge all of you to act on this. Do some kind of human rights work. Speak out from time to time when certain issues bother you. Don't keep quiet because somebody is watching you, this, that, and the other. I think that's very important for everybody. That the only way to change things is by talking about things, by criticizing what is happening. Nobody is telling anybody to take up arms and all that. That's not the issue. The issue is that at least speak out about what is happening. Speak about what is happening. Be critical when you see some power being misused, etc., etc. And I think that's very important. That's it. Yog.
Now let me take two questions that you asked. The first being, where does hope lie? How do you see this improving? Wherein is the solution? I think central to everything Mihir and I have said, is the judiciary being independent. The judiciary must stand up against the powerful state. I don't care about right-wing, left-wing governments. It don't matter. I'm concerned about an independent judiciary. And let me tell you, there have been witch hunts of an equally pernicious nature under the Congress regime. Let us not think that witch hunts are the preserve and the prerogative of the BJP. They are not. They are there in all governments which want to reach and overreach. So you need a strong and independent judiciary. Without that, there is no hope. Our only hope is that from the top to the bottom, the judiciary discovers that it has a backbone. If they are going to behave like invertebrates, we have no hope. That's the first thing. The second thing, you spoke about the hope for humanity, faith in humanity. Don't mix up governments and police officers with humanity. There is a great deal of humanity in this world. You have to only hear what Father Stan says about how he has been helped in prison by other inmates. If someone like Stan's faith in humanity is not shaken, despite everything he has suffered, then that is a lesson for us all. Let us not just give up so quickly. Let us take inspiration from these figures.
Absolutely.
So before we let you go, just one last thing. I am reminded by your presence, by everything that we discussed today. I'm reminded by this one quote by Edmund Burke when he was talking about advocates, good advocates, that they augur misgovernment at a distance and snuff the approach of tyranny in the ever tainted breeze. And both of you just are personification of that quote for me. So thank you so much for inspiring us, for telling us that it's okay to still speak up. We will not be jailed for it. We just need to. We might, but as advocates, we have this duty, and we should fulfill our responsibility.
And just remember that both of us are looking happy, correct? So doing this work is not a journey on unhappiness. Please, we are very happy in what we are doing, and we are glad that we were here. And thank you very much for this session.
Thank you so much, sir. For everybody, I understand you had a lot of questions. We can't answer all of them. We had limited time, but we can keep the conversation going. The video will be uploaded on our YouTube channel on Locktopus, the YouTube channel. You can always subscribe to it. We'll upload the video. We can keep the conversation going, and we hope that Mihir sir and Yug sir will grace us with their presence again, and we can probably discuss this further. They are extremely busy, and we are very, very lucky to have had this time with them. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Sonali, for bringing them on board. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody.